A couple of weeks ago, I made a video about this simple half-lap joint and all the different ways you can use it. And I got a lot of comments from folks that said, Rex, that's a great joint and it is really simple, but you gotta be kidding. I can't saw that straight. And if you're doing hand tool woodwork and you can't saw a couple of straight lines to make this simple joint, that is a real problem and you need to take care of that. But good news. I think we can fix your sawing, and we can start right now in this video. Sawing in a straight line is difficult, and it's hard for a couple of reasons. First, there's your arm, which is this big floppy thing that's really good at moving in all kinds of different directions. Wonderful for your day-to-day life as a human, but not very useful if you need it to track back and forth in a straight line. It's just not very good at that. Second thing is your eyes. They're great at telling when a line is straight, but your eyes aren't very good at knowing when a line is plumb or perpendicular. So if I took this board and just put it in the vise and tried to cross-cut it, I guarantee you I wouldn't get a straight cross-cut. My eyes just can't judge that. With sawing, the first thing you need to do is realize that these problems exist, and they're big problems, but you can just design your sawing practice to fix them. And we're going to start with two things: layout and body mechanics. When I make almost any saw cut, my layout is a pair of lines, not just one. So if I were going to cross cut across this board, of course, I'd make one layout line here across the top, and of course I'm using a square, but that's not enough to get a square cut. I'm always going to carry that line down another face of the board. So I've got two lines that meet at a right angle. And the second line is always going to be something that I can see really easily. I made this line over here for the camera so you can see it. But if I were really about to make this cut, I would do the line facing me. That gives me two lines like this. And I use that layout for all my saw cuts. Cross cuts, rip cuts, cutting tenons, even dovetailing. They all have that same two-line layout. And that two-line 90-degree layout really helps with body mechanics. But before we talk about body mechanics, let's talk about saws. If you're going to do good joinery type saws, you need a back saw, a saw with a heavy metal spine. In this video, I am using a Bad Axe No. 9, a pricey tenon saw. But you don't need to use an expensive saw like this. If you need something really affordable, get this Spear & Jackson tenon saw. It's $38 on Amazon, and it does not come ready to work. You're going to have to resharpen it, rework the handle, do a bunch of things, but I've got a complete video to show you how to do all of that for free. If you're not interested in doing a big restoration hot rod job, then I recommend this Crown tenon saw. You can also get this off of Amazon. It's $97. It's got a super heavy brass spine that I like a lot, and it comes ready to cut right out of the box. Now, this is hard to believe, but for the exact same amount of money, $97, you can also buy the Veritas Rip Carcass Saw. Carcass saw is a tiny bit smaller than a tenon saw, but that won't bother you. Veritas saws are beautifully made, wonderfully sharpened and polished with an unbelievably comfortable handle. Personally, I find them a little light. This molded spine doesn't have the weight of brass, and I think that does make a difference when you're cutting. But if you bought a saw like this for less than $100, you wouldn't be disappointed with it. Finally, I'm focusing on Western saws in this video because that's what I use, but of course, Japanese saws are also great for joinery, so a saw like this Dozuki would also be a good choice. I use these saws, but not every day, so I'm going to leave these to the experts. But now that we've got a saw, and we've got our layout figured out, now let's talk about body mechanics. Now, we said before that your arm is floppy, and that's true. It's not very dependable, but you've got one joint that you really can depend on, your shoulder. If you let your arm hang down and then move it back and forth, your shoulder is going to let your arm swing like a pendulum, back and forth in a dependable straight line. Now we'll bend at the elbow, and this is already starting to look like a sawing stroke. And now we'll add a saw. And now we've got a complete sawing stroke. Nice straight line, back and forth. Now you might notice one part about this stroke isn't perfectly straight. It's moving in an arc. So at the top of my sawing stroke, my saw is up high. And that's a good thing. If your saw is moving up at the end of each arc, then it's really easy to saw on both of your layout lines at the same time. And if you're tracking two perpendicular lines at once, then you are guaranteed to get a straight cut because of geometry and stuff. The lines on my work are really important, but those lines have to extend past my work. Whenever I have a cut like this, I use my imagination to visualize that top line actually going all the way across the top of the bench and even out into my shop. And that top line going all the way across the bench, that's the plane that my saw is moving in. I'm going to line my saw up with that line I see going across the bench top, and that's going to keep me going straight through the whole cut. Visualizing and extending those cut lines can also solve the biggest mechanical issue that I see. A lot of beginners, when they're sawing, they're going like this, and the saw stops because it hits them in the gut. And what they're doing is they're bending and unbending their wrist, trying to keep the saw going straight, even as it keeps crashing into their body. This is never going to work. Your body needs to be out of the way. Now, here's where I can give you my most valuable tip. I extend my cut line, not just across the bench, but also down the front of my bench and across the floor next to me. And when I'm sawing, I actually think this to myself. I think, hey, get your feet behind the line. Because if both of your feet are behind your cut line, then your body is going to be out of the way. Then your saw can move smoothly, and you're going to have a much better cut. A lot of people talk about using the reflective plate of your saw to find when that saw is square to the work. And it totally works. If I put this saw on this piece of wood and look at the reflection of the wood, I can tell when I'm off. That's wrong, that's wrong. And as soon as the wood seems to go seamlessly into that reflection in a straight line, well, now I'm dead straight. The only problem is this doesn't actually work for cutting with a back saw. If I'm in my correct ergonomic position with my feet behind the line, I can't see my saw plate. I'd have to do this or something. The only reason I can see it now is I'm looking at the other camera. This doesn't really work for precision sawing with a back saw, and I don't use it. But I use it all the time over at the saw bench. If I'm doing a crosscut over at the saw bench, my body mechanics are pretty different. I'm in the tripod stance. My foot is point number 1, my knee is point number 2, and my left hand is point number 3. And because of where I have the saw, well, I can just see that plate a little more clearly. Also, when I'm doing stock breakdown cuts with a bigger saw, my elbow is much more involved. My shoulder is still swinging back and forth in that pendulum motion, but I'm using my elbow for much more power. When I'm in this stance, well, it's actually quite a bit easier to see what's going on with that reflection, and I can adjust that saw until it's perfectly plumb. I use this trick sometimes. More often, I just rely on my layout lines, and it's very easy to make this cut really square. When you can actually see the reflection in the plate of your saw, then you can use it to keep perpendicular. But that technique doesn't work so well with a fine back saw. For making my finest cuts, especially joinery cuts, I don't use the reflection in the saw plate. Instead, I get more precision by breaking that cut down into a couple of different steps. For this rip cut I've laid out here, I'm going to start just by cutting a kerf across the top of the board. Now, I don't have to worry too much about whether or not the saw is plumb. With this heavy spine, I can just feel plumb with my hand. You'll be surprised how easy that is. And I'm going to do a very light kerf, so if I'm off by a degree this way, it's not going to make any difference. The cut's too shallow. All I'm worried about is connecting this point to this point in a straight line, and that's not very hard. Perfect. Now I have a shallow kerf that goes all the way across the top of that board. That means my saw can't be off in this dimension. That's been taken care of. Now I'm going to track down that line closest to me at an angle, like this. And here, my saw is well buried in the wood, and I've cut all the way across that top line. Now that the saw is in the wood like this, it's locked in place. I really can't move it, and it's going to track straight no matter what I do. Watch. That's the great thing about making precise cuts with a back saw. As long as you start straight, the rest of that cut is going to be straight. This cut can't go off. In a video about sawing straight and square and even sawing joinery cuts, it's surprising that I didn't talk about the famous knife wall technique. This is where you knife a line very deeply across your work, then chisel out a shallow trench and use that trench to guide your back saw into the cut. It's one of those can't-miss techniques that always gives you a great result. I didn't talk about it in this video because other people have covered it very well, and because you can't rely on it for all your cuts. For one thing, it's way too time-consuming. You can't cut and chisel every single time you make a precision cut, even a joinery cut. You also can't chisel out that knife wall very well across end grain, so that technique isn't going to get you through something like a dovetail, and you're not going to knife wall every single one of your dovetails. That would take forever. As a hand tool woodworker, the ability to strike a line in pencil, put your saw on that line, and cut it square and plumb, that is a core skill. It's one that you have to have. So in this video, I've laid out all the best techniques I have for getting that skill of putting down a line and cutting right on it. But don't use these techniques on your next project. That's too late. You need to use these techniques before your next project. You need to practice. If you've been watching my channel, you saw that coming a mile away. I'm always telling people to practice. Go out in your shop, take a 2x4, put 20 lines on it, and reduce that thing to kindling. Give yourself permission to be bad. Just be terrible in the beginning. Get better as you progress. Come back the next day, get a little better. After a couple of days, you will have refined these techniques. You will be cutting better. I absolutely promise you. And then you can use these techniques in your next project. Now, as far as sawing, I have to mention my biggest sawing inspiration, Shannon Rogers, the Renaissance woodworker. He did a lecture for my patrons a few years, three or 4 years ago? Wow, it's a really long time ago. He did our first lecture in a series we did called the Workbench Sessions. Shannon gave us an hour-long tutorial on sawing that blew my mind. Honestly, it scared me a little bit because I realized my sawing skills were not good. And after I watched his lecture, I've been focusing so much more on my sawing in the several years since then, and it's improved a lot. And a couple of the ideas I got from that presentation, they worked their way into this video. But Shannon has so much more to share about sawing and every other technique. If you'd like to see that lecture he did, it's just for patrons, but you can join Patreon for only $5 a month at patreon.com/Rex Krueger. Get the complete Workbench session archives, free plans, a great discussion forum. I think everybody knows at this point, but you might also want to go straight to the source. Shannon is right here on YouTube at The Renaissance Woodworker, and he has his own online platform, the Hand Tool School, that has a sterling reputation. People who are members absolutely love it. And I think that you should check it out. Finally, we talked about a bazillion saws in this video. Many of them are affordable, and you need a decent back saw to make joinery quality cuts. We will leave links to all of these tools down in the description, and we're going to see you next week with more affordable woodworking, and we hope you'll join us. Thanks for watching.